I'm really excited to kick off this first conversation. I've been in Paris for about 12 years working in tech. And a long time ago, when I was just a little blogger, someone said, "Would you like to meet the guy who built the little orange cone that's on your computer?" And I said, "Oh my God, I would love to." And just down the street from here, I got to meet our next speaker for the first time, maybe 10 years ago. Probably one of the most impressive people I've ever met in the Paris startup ecosystem. Let's give a huge round of applause to Jean-Baptiste. Was that too much praise?
A bit too much.
A bit too much? I'm sorry. I know. I knew you wouldn't like it. I apologize. Do you remember the Gandhi office?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm sure you remember. Okay. So, look, we were talking the other day, and I said, JB, I want you to come out and talk about what you think about the relationship between companies and open source and how you feel about the sort of the state of open source today.
So the state of open source is pretty good, right? Because like 20 years ago when I started working on VLC, like you talk to Microsoft, you were evil, right? Like there was just like this fight, and if you work on open source, you're working on communism, which is like one of the biggest insults from any American guy. And now all those companies are either using or building on open source, right? Like when we talk to one of good friend who's SRE at Facebook, he says like more than 90% of the code running on Facebook servers are actually open source. Well, of course, the Linux kernel, but so many tools, deployment, and so on. So the state of open source is pretty good if you look at that. The state of founding open source is a bit more problematic, right? So some people are doing well and some a bit less.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about that. I mean, what does open source need to thrive?
Well, it doesn't mean anything anymore, right? Like that's a bit the problem, right? Like the people who are actually building on community insist on using free software because open source can mean so many things, from actual community working together to Microsoft. So actually, open source is a way of development that is now being used everywhere more than a business model, right? Because you have many open source business models from Red Hat to many others. And so you have multiple open source. But the idea is always the same. It's more like a new way of doing development and a new philosophy than actually something business-like.
And what do you see? So you talked about Facebook and a lot of their 90% of their code running in open source. I would see that as a success for open source. But it doesn't seem like you see it that way.
Well, it depends, right? Like there are some people who are pretty okay. So Facebook is on the pretty okay side, and there are people who are like pillaging open source, right? They don't contribute anything, or they are actually hurting open source. Of course, people like Oracle or Amazon, right, on this category. Then you got people like Meta and Facebook and Google who are in the middle. And then you have actual now startups who are full open source, and like GitLab or Sentry. And those are the things that I really like to see. But you have some very good to very bad.
And what, I mean, almost every engineering team I know is running on, around, or using open source. At Scaleway, there's the open stack for the cloud, or there's Kubernetes, or there's all the open source database formats. What do you think a company like Scaleway or a startup like any of the logos you can see from here, what should they be doing?
Contribute back, right? Like either money or engineering time, but like most people just take it and don't build anything, right? And of course, the big projects like the Linux kernel have too much resources and too many people working on it. But so many small or to medium-sized projects have no one. Like curl has one guy. The SSL issues that we've seen where there is one or two guys who are building the whole things, and then there is millions done on integrating all that, right? And there is a lot of money on JavaScript framework and so on, but nothing on what is just under it, right? And on video, it's like FFmpeg X264 VLC is like powering all video online, like YouTube, Vimeo, Twitch, Facebook video, Apple, and so on. And yet what they contribute is extremely little. In video, it's like really a catastrophe.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you point out, a lot of the underbelly of the internet, a lot of the sort of core components run on open source, and yet if the companies that are leveraging it aren't getting interested in contributing back, we're creating a gap. No, do you feel like there's a risk of creating this sort of legacy open source or
But
debt?
it actually happens already, right? There is so many security issues because the underlying components are not well tested, right? Like you run npm and then you download 900 dependencies. There is no fucking way that you ever tested all those, or that you even know either the license or whatever is running there. Like, don't bullshit me, right? It's impossible. The thing is, especially American companies have like this top focus on short term, next quarter, next bonus, 6 months, 6 months, 6 months, 6 months. So there is no, even internally, there is no incentive on cleaning their legacy debt, even for their own code. So you imagine for open source, it's ridiculous, right? So what do, right? They say, oh, we need to care about open source. So they give a ton of money to the Linux Foundation, who has too much money, and that's it, right? And then they say, well, we contribute to open source, and they do a few projects that are their own, right? So, of course, React or ESLint for Meta, or for Google, Chrome and Kubernetes and so on. But most of the time, you can't contribute, right? Like, Chrome is not an open source project. Android is not an open source project, right? It's open source, but it's a code dump of 1 million lines of code. You cannot contribute. React is a bit different, so Meta is a bit better than Google than that, right? But, like, open source is not just the code, right? It's actually accepting contribution from the outside. And there is no like good way to give money to small players and small actors, or actually see how much value they're actually building. And it's a problem for everyone. And it's true, I don't have any good solution. But like many, we talked about the main companies, but also like startups, so many, like it's usual, right? They start, they build, they take everything, and they don't care. I have many, I know many video startups that got acquired and got a lot of money over the years, were basically using FFmpeg or X264, violating the license. Well, they don't care, right? And that is something that needs to change, right? The first step is contribute code, and then maybe a bit money.
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking about when we were talking the other day. I said it reminds me a lot of the same problem that musicians face. Is like the big artists get a disproportionately large amount, even bigger than their fame, amount of money. Foo Fighters and Taylor Swift and Beyonce.
Well, yeah, exactly.
But then independent artists.
The Spotify model and the Deezer model, but in France, even the SACEM and SSED, those people just favorite the big artists and don't favor back the small ones. But at least for musicians, they have a kind of union consortium where you can give money, and those are the ones who cheat and don't give it to small ones. Here it's more complex. Like, how much do you depend on open source? A lot, but how can you contribute, right? Because so many companies don't know where to send the money.
What would you suggest to let's take the well-intentioned, long-term visionist engineering leader, right? What you might describe as the atypical VP engineering.
But let's imagine that one.
Let's imagine that.
Okay.
And they say, look, I see that my team is leveraging open source. I even see some of them are noticing bugs and issues.
So I had that with a big French company, bank, and I said there is 3 stages, right? The first is use it and say that you use it, right? It's important for open source project to know that big companies are using it because it builds credibility, it brings new developers, it brings the source. The second one is actually contribute back for the one that you use, right? So you allow 20% of your time of your engineer to actually go and build on the open source tools that you're using. And the last one is create open source and give some money, right? So you see a few projects that seems to be core to your team and don't seem that they're huge, and go there, check who they are, and give money.
What's an open source project that you love right now? What gets you excited in open source?
There are many projects I really like, but currently what I like is the open source startups, right? Sentry, I really love the idea, right? Say, everything they do is open source. You can deploy, and it's SaaS, right? So either you deploy yourself or you do a SaaS. And this is, in my opinion, the best thing for open source because it's a clear business model, right? People use SaaS everywhere. So one of the SaaS, it's okay. And use the techniques of SaaS startup, but to do open source. This is what I like the most. But as new tech, nothing very specific.
Okay, well, I mean, it works out really well because you're leading right well into my next panel, which is a bunch of CTOs of open source startups.
Cool, do that.
Okay.
Thank you very much, man.
Please give JB a huge round of applause. Thank you very much, buddy. you.